So the blueprint for building safety regulations has been provided by Dame Judith Hackett post-Grenfell report, and it highlighted the importance of the golden thread of information throughout a building's life cycle. What do you think are the key benefits of this approach?
So the Building Safety Act has enabled a number of very significant changes to the way our sector is going to work, not just for high-rise buildings, but all buildings. Specifically, the golden thread element of information is really critical, because what it acknowledges very openly is the need by future users of buildings and future stakeholders associated to an individual building for an accurate record of information that's come out of activities undertaken from previous, so particularly in design construction process. So hopefully, and I can see a real benefit in that in the operations of buildings in the future. So if you have a genuinely detailed account of what is in your building, how was it designed to be operated, what were the design intents, and what has been done to the building since it was originally built, it arms future users who perhaps need to look at modifying that building, or just in terms of driving efficient use of that building. It arms you with the information you need to make detailed decisions with much greater certainty. So hopefully what you'll see is buildings which over time perform much better in their operations, and safer, of course, and healthier. But also when we come to key points in those buildings' lives, so fit-outs, refurbishments, possibly end of life, those processes can be undertaken with much greater planning and detailed design and achieve hopefully greater performance, reduced environmental impact. For example, we know that one of the key operational points in a building is when it goes through a refurbishment at some point or improvement of systems. Every time there's an intervention like that, there are opportunities to make further savings or make further investments in higher performance. But for that, you need to have the confidence to make those decisions. You need really detailed information. Likewise, the other good example, if we start thinking about circular economy elements, if you know what a building is built out of in detail, you know the grades and quantities of materials. When a building comes to its end of life, you can perhaps start looking at the value of disassembly versus just demolishing. And so we can start looking at whole life impacts in a much, much more meaningful way.
You were involved in BRAC and the working group involved in the Future Home Standard. So could you talk me through a little bit about your involvement in that?
Yes, so BRAC is the Building Regulations Advisory Committee, or I should say was, because it's recently been wound up as part of the reforms resulting from the Building Safety Bill. Its role was to advise ultimately ministers, but in practice officials, in the development of building regulations, principally for England, but also became the lead group for which many of the devolved administrations also followed. My involvement in that goes back to about 2014, up until it was wound up recently. And amongst a variety of things we dealt with, as you can imagine, under the auspices of building regulations, I took a particular lead on and chaired the BRAC working group looking at the Future Home Standard, which has resulted in the 2021 changes to Part L and F, and the introductions of two new bits of the building regulations in terms of O and S, also nicknamed now as FLOSS. And that sets the scene as a stepping stone towards 2025, which will be the implementation of the Future Home Standard, which is aimed about ensuring all new homes moving forward are able to be zero carbon and are built in a way that should be more climate resilient and very much including the features they'll need for the future in what should be a net zero carbon world, for which those buildings will spend most of their useful life operating in.
We think that there will be much more, as you say, looking at disassembly and having products that are demountable to be able to be reused, and that should be the first step. Do you think there's enough of a focus on reuse of existing materials, or is it just cheaper and easier just to knock it down, grind it up, landfill, use it as hardcore?
I don't think it's cheaper, but that is the behaviour set in the sector. We tend to either knock down and rebuild, or we strip out and refit. It's not cheaper. Our own experience in refurbishing of our own headquarters building, we were able to radically reduce the amount of materials and materials impacts of a very significant refurbishment of our building, but also at a probably 60% lower cost than rebuilding, and still get a very, very high performing, very, very nice building to be in that's representative of our organisation. So there are definitely economic benefits by reusing and repurposing both products and buildings. The challenge is having the confidence to be able to enable those. So if you have to have a good understanding of what's there, otherwise you'll never reuse something, because how do you know if you don't know what it is, how do you know if it's going to meet your requirements? So that's where golden thread comes in, but it's also a behavioural piece. You have to approach a refurbishment perhaps with more time in the design phase to analyse the existing building, to look at what can, and think through how can you reuse things and reuse elements in a meaningful way. Otherwise, what happens is you can make some pretty serious mistakes. But there's a massive opportunity there, and it is definitely cheaper, but we have to do it right if we are going to keep people safe and achieve the broader environmental savings we wish to.
The Building Safety Act and the establishment of it in 2002 has seen the introduction of clear accountability and statutory responsibilities for unaccountable persons. So what are your thoughts on this shift on focus towards sort of individual competence, and how can this competence be proven in an industry where a lot of it is experience?
So I think it's a very interesting thing around proven competence, but also about duties and responsibilities. And that actually starts with clients. I mean, what's very interesting about the Building Safety Act is how much additional responsibility is being put on clients to appoint competent people, to ensure sufficient time and resources available for them to be able to undertake their jobs correctly and safely. And if they don't, obviously accountability goes back to them. So this is going to affect every stakeholder, whether you're a client or an owner, designer, contractor, or building maintenance operatives. This is a fundamental shift. Much greater accountability, but also then an onus on you as individual professionals to demonstrate your competence. And our industry is very much driven by procurement. And so people either buy a product in or buy a service in. If the onus is on the owners and operators to appoint competent people, it seems to me that in practice what's going to happen is very quickly all tender documents are going to have to start including why we believe my team and the individuals on my team are competent. And so organisations and individuals are going to have to start thinking about how do you show that? And for different types of buildings on different projects, that could be quite difficult, particularly when you start getting into high-risk buildings, or high-rise and high-risk buildings. Very specific requirements start to come into play. So I think you see in large part a cultural shift around starting to think about competence of individuals and organisational competence. How does an organisation manage its people? How does it ensure that the people it has how does it know its people are competent to what levels? And how does it go about assigning the right people to the right roles? So I think and I can see lots of management system elements there. Lots of behaviour change, possibly some certification elements for coming into play at organisational levels, but also then much greater onus on individuals, not just to do their training in CPD and tell the story about what their experience is, but actually document that much more in a meaningful way. So for us at CABE, we're introducing a process of logbooks where individuals, instead of just doing a CPD return counted in hours, we're aiming to move to a world where professionals do a logbook, a bit like a pilot would, that accounts for documents what projects they've worked on. Were there any near misses? What training and development needs have they identified in the year, and what training and development have they done to try and address those gaps? And so you get a much more meaningful record, but hopefully also reflection of why I believe I'm competent. And then taking that further for specific roles, particularly roles that are being regulated, those processes can be tied into very specific competency assessments through third parties, and we see that as a key role of the professional bodies to be able to provide those services, enable those engineers, their members, to be able to demonstrate their competence in a much more granular way than what we have done in the past.
What are the three gateways in the Building Safety Act, and what challenges do you see with each of them?
So the Building Safety Act, this is the bit of the Act that's specifically related to high-rise, high-risk buildings, so the buildings that fall under the direct regulatory control of the new Building Safety Regulator. They've instituted three gateways, one at outline planning stage, one at end of complete design, and then one on completion of the building before occupation. These are obviously very formal gateways, and so while in theory nothing has changed, perhaps the way we work, everything has changed. So much greater, gateway one for planning, much greater emphasis of thinking about how this building is actually going to operate and comply in the future than perhaps we would have done at planning stage further. So more thinking up front. But then obviously having to carry that over into gateways, into the design and construction phases and deliver those elements. And with hard stop checks and approvals by the regulator, if you make changes, you have to comply with them or go back and get a retrospective approval. Likewise, you can't carry on working to the next phase until you've got approval on those gateways. So again, that's quite big procedural and behavioural changes within the sector. In the design stage, it's going to require much greater level of design. The buildings, you won't proceed to construction until all of the design is done in detail, and probably at a level of detail that people haven't thought about in many years, where what's the exact location of service penetrations through a compartmental wall, for example. That's a level of thought that is often in practice worked out on site currently, whereas now will have to be designed in detail. And then in construction, of course, people have to get back in the habit of building exactly what was designed and being able to show it at the end before that building can be occupied. The consequences, of course, are significant in the fact that unless the regulator agrees that all three have been met, the building can't be occupied.
What sort of an impact do you think that will have specifically on design and build projects?
It's going to have a very significant impact on design build. And I personally question how viable a design build approach will be on HRBs. All of this is around much greater planning, design and thought up front and documenting as it's built. And so the design build contracts in HRBs, I can see a number of challenges coming up. Not least of which, because every time you make a design change, you've got to go back to the regulator and get it approved. And so if you did go down that approach, there could be an awful lot of stop-start on the construction, or you are carrying huge amounts of risk at the end in that the regulator may say no.
It's really hoped that the Building Safety Act represents a new era for UK construction. How will the Act affect the building industry over the short, medium and then the longer term going forwards?
So fundamentally, I mean, a lot of what we've talked about so far is about behaviour and culture. I think that is the big change in that, for decades we've progressively taken more risk and we've pushed more and more of the detailed design into the construction phases. So I think it's almost going back to some old-fashioned ideas about designing a building in its entirety before you build it. And then building it as designed and always checking if you vary a design back with the designers to ensure that the variations you're making aren't going to have a material impact on the performance or safety or the integrity of the design within that building. The other big new area, and I believe this is hugely important, of course, this puts legal requirements and building regulations for the first time on buildings in use and in that occupied phase. So I suspect you're going to see much greater focus, much greater structure, and arguably the professionalisation of the maintenance and operations of building in that occupied phase in a way that we haven't seen for a very long time.
Do you think it will drive an adoption or further adoption of BIM and digital information? rather than if you're sort of designing everything at the early phases, having old-fashioned reams of paper, everywhere.
I mean, and ultimately, how you discharge the duties will be down to you. But clearly, certainly on larger complex buildings, there is going to be a real benefit to doing that digitally in a controlled and managed way that will better enable collaboration at the design phases, better coordinate trades during construction and planning, and ultimately put a very, very powerful resource in the form of a digital twin, is often the term used, of the building in the hands of the people owning and operating the building moving forward. And in the future, if that is maintained, that design, that digital twin, that data is maintained properly over time, you could see all sorts of very, very powerful additional services that you could automate. Mm-hmm. Security, operations, maintenance, all sorts of things that you could almost have digitally enhanced services for. But you can't do that unless you've got a really detailed digital model of the building itself. So I don't think it'll be mandated, mm-hmm. but I think there will be real benefits to doing it. But you only actually get the long-term benefits if that data is maintained, properly handed over between the different stakeholders over the life cycle of the building.
I understand that CABE have recently become the first professional institute to be approved by the Engineering Council as part of the Higher Risk Building Registration Scheme. Can you explain what that means? Yeah,
so it's something we're very, very excited about, and is the culmination of many years working with the various industry groups that were formed after, specifically in response to Dame Judith's report. One of the elements of that was this idea that if you're working on high-risk buildings, you're going to have to demonstrate your competence, because that's now a mandatory requirement. What wasn't set about was exactly how people do that. So within the Engineering Council, a number of industry bodies and a number of particularly professional engineering institutions got together, say we've got to provide a way that people can practically and meaningfully do this in a way that's third-party recognised. And so a number of the professional institutions, under the leadership and umbrella of the Engineering Council, have been developing standards for and definitions of competency and methods by which those can be recognised to international standards. And so we're very pleased to say that CABE is the first one approved, and that's to a general engineering standard. So this is suitable for anyone who's working on design, operation and maintenance of high-rise buildings in a technical decision-making capacity. And it provides them a route through tried and tested Engineering Council registration processes to demonstrate their competence. We fully expect and look forward to other professional engineering institutions to come forward with similar schemes, and they are likely, in particular, they will cover very specific areas of practice, so structural engineering, building services engineering, fire engineering. We expect the relevant institutions also to join that. And so we will have a route by which individual engineers can demonstrate their competence, and therefore hopefully that will support the creation of a market ecosystem where there are the competent and proven competent people to undertake this work. And that is at the heart of the cultural and behaviour change we're talking that our sector needs to deliver high performance, safe buildings that meet public expectations.
How will the high-risk buildings registration scheme work, and how will it measure competency?
Okay, so the scheme we've developed with the Engineering Council is very much based on the Engineering Council registration processes. And so effectively what that means is we have developed a tailored or contextualised version of our competency frameworks that are adapted to cover the elements of knowledge and understanding and skills required to discharge those roles in a high-risk building. In particular for the UK, we're talking about buildings, residential buildings over 18 metres. Individuals then demonstrate that competence through the creation of a portfolio of evidence, very much what we were talking about before, like a logbook, documenting their experience, documenting their qualifications, and also then providing a technical report on their involvement in projects of that type. And ultimately they go before a panel of other chartered engineers who assess whether or not they indeed have the competence. If successful, they are registered and placed on, and the Engineering Council has created a new specific register for engineers who are qualified for the HRB buildings, and so and this is available at both the high chartered engineer level, also the incorporated engineer level, so for people perhaps more junior in their careers coming through, but also at the engineering technician level. And this is an area we think is really, really important, where you've got individual maintenance operators, individuals perhaps looking after a team in an installation or maintenance capability, will also have to demonstrate they understand the particular nuances of operating in those buildings, and so that they're not undertaking activities in, I don't know what it is, installing a pipe that undermines the fire protection to the structure of the building.
So what do you see as the biggest challenges of implementing the Building Safety Act?
I think the biggest challenge is going to be the extent of change that this is going to happen. And this is happening at a time when we have already got skill shortages in the sector. And so the medium and long term looks very positive in the fact that I can see, where we're in a market where we are using people with proven competence, and the people with proven competence have a benefit in the marketplace. In other words, they're not having to compete against everyone else, including people who are not compliant. I think that bodes well for the long term. But in the short term, there is a significant amount of reskilling and upskilling needed in a market that's already got a shortage of people. And so that's going to create some challenges, certainly in the short term, as we get used to this new market. But I can see a situation in the future where the market is much healthier. You'll compete on innovation and quality of service, not necessarily on compliance. And we know at the moment people do compete in the marketplace, not by doing better, but finding easier ways through the regulations. And that can't be acceptable in the future.
Gavin, thank you very much for your time. It's certainly an awful lot of changes coming on in relation to building safety going forward. So thank you very much for your input.
You're very welcome. Obviously, the situation that's created these changes is tragic. I think it's really important that we all learn from them. Here at CABE, we're trying to do our bit, and we hope the rest of the sector will join us.